Philosophy, etymologically, by the way, just means the love of wisdom, right? Sophia is wisdom, and philo just means love. So it's the love of wisdom. When you do it explicitly, it's what we call philosophy. But basically, everyone has a philosophy, because a philosophy is an answer to the following questions. What is real? And the branch that studies that is called metaphysics. You saw a moment ago. That's what we're going to be learning in 2 weeks. How do I know it? The branch of philosophy that studies that is called epistemology. We're actually going to study that through the intermediary of something called philosophy of science. And what should I do? And that's a branch of philosophy called ethics, which we'll also spend some time looking at, actually 2 weeks later in the term. And we're going to work our way from the inside out. So we're going to start from the inside, and we're going to work through the second Tupperware container and so on. But remember, there's a certain logical asymmetry. That's why I put these boxes. If you do ethics, you thereby have to do some epistemology and metaphysics, but not the other way around. Questions about what exists don't necessarily require any complicated account about what it means to be a knower. And questions about what it means to be a knower don't necessarily require a complicated answer to what you ought to do. And everyone must have good or bad answers to these questions. And chances are you right now have a mix of good and bad answers to these questions, and you can't tell which is which. Of course, you all think it's a good answer because you took them on. But how can you tell whether they're good answers or bad answers until you've really spelled them out, right? And that's what we're going to do in this class. And the one tool, because these are different branches, right? The one tool that we philosophers, even though everyone has a philosophy, not everyone does philosophy. The one tool that's going to distinguish us and that's going to make these inquiries different from just reporting on our feelings is that we're going to use logic. Logic is going to be the one tool, I'm putting it across all of our boxes here, it's the one tool that we'll be using throughout this entire course. And you don't know anything about logic. You're logical persons to a certain extent, but you have some familiarity with that word. You're probably thinking of Mr. Spock from Star Trek or something like that. What we're going to do today is, just as we took baby steps into figuring out what philosophy was, we're going to take baby steps into figuring out what logic is. And the payoff for today's class is amazing because we'll use that throughout the entire class. It is really important for a philosopher to employ logic. All right? And so that's where our subject matter of today is. It's not necessarily another branch of philosophy. It's the method that cuts across all of the branches of philosophy. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. And again, I use that as a nice chance to eat some eggs. Because I'm having breakfast with you, and I want to be clear. And you can take whole courses on logic, by the way, though. Even if it's not a branch of philosophy, it's developed enough that you might want to take an entire course on that. I'm teaching one section of logic right now. I teach it at the advanced level as well, so it's really neat. And critical thinking would also be a course that is in the vicinity. Arnav writes, is the question of how even important sometimes? Not quite sure what you mean, Arnav. The question of how, okay, because I've been asking the question why. Is that right, Arnav? Is that what you mean? Because I kept talking about the question why being central to philosophy, right? And you're asking how. Okay, is that what you're asking? Cool, all right, neat. Less so for us, Arnav. How could be relevant if you have to frame it, because how, I mean, what specifically, right? But you look here, how do I know, right? That's an interesting one. Like assume, for instance, that you clearly have to know something. Like I don't know which particular bits of knowledge you have. Like you know a bunch of stuff, and some of it's probably mistaken. And of course, if it's mistaken, you don't know it, right? You can't know something that's false. You're mistaken in that regard. So what we want to do when we turn around and we ask the epistemological question, how do I know it, is I'm asking, okay, look, clearly to some extent, I must be successful as a knower because I'm getting by in the world, even though I must be mistaken in some regards because I'm not a god. Arnav, so far, do you agree? Like you're not a god, but you're also not hopeless either. Like you're figuring stuff out at least well enough to show up and to be alive. Yeah. All right. So now you want to figure out and turn around, how is this possible? Right? And if you ask that, then you're asking the question of epistemology. The question why is going to come in when you give me an answer to this how question. So Arnav, for instance, imagine that you tell me a theory. Let's call this theory T. And that's a theory of knowledge. It's a story about how you come to know. And let's say it involves perception, your sense organs, scientific inquiry, yada, 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 right? Okay, fair enough, man. You give me this theory. Then, of course, then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to ask, why should I agree to this theory? And then you're going to have to supply me with good reasons for accepting this theory about how you know. All right, so let's go and start now learning argument diagramming. As I said, logic is a thing you can take. Logic is divided, if you want, you can divide it into two branches: formal logic and informal logic. Today we're going to be learning informal logic. This would be critical thinking. I'm introducing this in the class precisely because I'm working from the assumption that you don't have that basic toolkit. So what we're going to do is a very quick rendition of this. We're just going to spend one class on it, and then we'll fine tune and practice that throughout the entire semester. Now, I just want to flag, there's a lot of things we could be saying about this subject matter, but I'm just going to give you the starter kit, the minimum that you need in order to get by. Kind of like if you take a self-defense class. Like if you take a self-defense class, you don't necessarily want to be the new George St. Pierre or, mixed martial arts master or champion. You just want to know some basics so that you can kind of, if you find yourself in a bad situation, get your way out of it. It's the same thing. Today we're going to just do a basic kit to get you started. It's not like we're going to go in depth. If you love it, though, you can focus just on that and do a separate course. I'd love it if you took one. They're really good for every student, and obviously they boost your abilities in philosophy. But the first distinction that we want to master is the distinction between a premise and a conclusion. I'm going to use a reading, and as promised, by doing the class, you essentially get an audiobook. I'm going to read this reading with you. Is everyone good to go? Tell me good to go if you're good to go. I'm going to stretch myself, stretch my hamstrings. Get ready to take on my audiobook voice. You're going to get a beautiful audiobook. We're going to do the reading together. And at some points, I'll pause and we'll do some practices. When people are good to go, stretching my back. All right, good. Let's do this. Let's do this. Now, there are some things that we can know simply by observation. You can tell whether it's raining simply by looking outside. You can tell whether the bathwater is warm by putting your hand in it. Your own experience, including the memory of things you perceived in the past, is your basic window on the world. But no matter how much you've seen and done, only a small portion of the world has passed before your window. For every fact you have observed directly, you know a great many things that you haven't observed. For example, how do you know what year you were born? Obviously, you did not witness your own birth. You were told about it by your parents, who did experience the event, and you trust what they told you. In the same way, you know that George Washington was the first president of the United States, and if you didn't, now you know, because you learned it from a history teacher or a textbook. In this case, neither the teacher nor the writer of the textbook witnessed Washington's presidency any more than you did. But they learned about it from other people who learned it from still others, extending back in the chain to people who were alive in 1788 and kept records of events at that time. A great deal of our knowledge comes from other people this way. Because we can communicate what we experience, human beings can merge their separate windows into one giant window. Still, much of the world lies beyond even that window. We have knowledge that transcends the collective experience of human beings in general. We know things about the origins of our planet, the reaches of outer space, the inner life of atoms, none of which has been directly observed by anyone. We make judgments about right and wrong, about character, about the rights of citizens, none of which is a matter of simple observation. In such cases, we proceed by means of reasoning. When we reason, we use relationships among propositions to push our knowledge beyond the limits of what we can experience directly. In this chapter, we'll begin our study of the reasoning process. Consider the proposition, rivers in Taiwan flow downhill. We know that this proposition is true, but how do we know it? Few of us have ever actually been to Taiwan to observe the rivers there or have even talked to people who have seen them. But we can establish the truth of sentence one by reasoning. We know from experience that the fluid nature of water makes it flow in the direction of the forces acting on it. And we know that the primary force is gravity, which pulls water downhill. These are general principles that apply everywhere, and they imply that rivers in Taiwan must behave like rivers in our environment. Here's another statement that calls for reasoning. The government should restrict ownership of handguns. This is one side of a controversial political issue. In this case, unlike the previous one, people tend to have strong opinions for or against the proposition, and they often argue about it. For that very reason, questions of truth and falsity may seem inappropriate here. But they are appropriate. When people argue about gun control, they're not merely voicing personal preferences as if they were talking about flavors of ice cream. They're trying to show that their position is true, and they will offer reasons. An advocate of gun control might argue that government should pursue the goal of reducing crime, and that restricting ownership of handguns would reduce crime. An opponent of gun control might argue that restricting ownership of handguns would violate the right of self-defense. These examples involve different types of reasoning, but they also illustrate a common pattern. In each case, we are concerned with the evidence for the truth of some proposition. In logic, this proposition is called a conclusion. The evidence in support of the conclusions consists of other propositions called premises. Thus, each of our examples involves the use of premises to support a conclusion. Here's the argument for the rivers in Taiwan. Premise 1. Water flows in the direction of the forces acting on it. Premise 2. The primary force acting on rivers in Taiwan is gravity. Premise 3. Gravity pulls downward. Therefore, escarque, conclusion, rivers in Taiwan flow downhill. Here's the argument for gun control, the for side. Premise 1. Restricting ownership of handguns would reduce crime. Premise 2. Government should pursue the goal of reducing crime. Therefore, there's the conclusion, government should restrict ownership of handguns. And here's an argument for the control gun issue, the against side. Premise 1. Restricting ownership of handguns would violate the right of self-defense. Therefore, conclusion, the government should not restrict ownership of handguns. For each conclusion, we have identified the premises that provide the evidence for that conclusion, and we have formulated those premises as distinct propositions. A set of premises, together with the conclusion, is called an argument. In everyday speech, this term is often used to mean a quarrel between two people, but it's also used to mean an appeal to evidence in support of a conclusion. In logic, we use the term argument in the latter sense. It's not between two people screaming at each other. Instead, it means a set of propositions in which some propositions, called the premises, are asserted as support or evidence for another proposition, the conclusion. Another way to put this is to say that the conclusion is inferred from the premises. Thus, an argument can also be described as an inference, and we'll use those terms interchangeably. Each of the following examples is an argument. By contrast, consider the following exchange. John says, the government ought to ban handguns. Mary says, that's not a good idea. John says, why not? I think it's a good idea. Mary says, well, I don't. In everyday speech, we might say that John and Mary are arguing about gun control, but neither of them is offering an argument in the logical sense. They're just expressing their views without giving reasons. What distinguishes an argument is the effort to support a statement logically. The author doesn't just tell us something that he takes to be true. He also presents reasons intended to convince us that it is true. This intention is usually signaled by certain verbal clues. For example, the word therefore indicates that a statement is intended as a conclusion. The word because usually indicates a premise. There are many such indicator words and phrases in English. So here's a nice table. Here are some premise indicators. So whatever comes after these words typically is a premise. Since, because, as, for, given that, assuming that, inasmuch as, the reason is that, blah, 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 in view of the fact that, and so on and so on. Or you have some in every language, like kyonki, for instance, right? Conclusion indicators, whatever comes after this, are conclusions. Therefore, escarque, thus, so, consequently, as a result, it follows that, hence, which means that, which implies that, and so on. So this box here, it's not exhaustive, but it really is an important box for you to study and practice. Because when you encounter such words, it's a good sign that you're in the presence of an argument and that you can use the indicator words to distinguish the premises from the conclusion. But you cannot use them mechanically. Some of the words are used in contexts other than argument. In the statement, "Since I arrived in Dry Gulch, I haven't seen a single green thing," the word "since" indicates a temporal relation, not a logical one. However, the absence of indicator words does not necessarily mean the absence of an argument. If I say, "Dry Gulch is an arid place, I haven't seen a single green thing," I'm offering evidence in support of a conclusion, even though I use no indicator words. To recognize an argument, the most important technique is to read carefully, asking what point the author is trying to make, isolating the propositions asserted, and identifying the relationships among them. Let's look at an example from a speech. "The truth is," Mr. Reagan said, "politics and morality are inseparable, and as morality's foundation is religion, religion and politics are necessarily related. We need religion as a guide." There are three propositions here. 1, politics and morality are inseparable. 2, morality's foundation is religion. And 3, religion and politics are necessarily related. The final sentence, "we need religion as a guide," is essentially a restatement of 3. Do we have an argument? Well, the word "as" indicates that 2 is intended as a premise. The word "necessarily" suggests that 3 is a conclusion. It means if you accept 1 and 2, you should accept 3 as well. So in essence, Mr. Reagan was saying, politics depends on morality, morality depends on religion, therefore, politics depends on religion. That's an argument. Let's consider one more example. The rule of law means that people should be punished only for a breach of a law, not by the arbitrary discretion of government. It means that law should be clearly stated and made open and made known to the public. And it means that law should be applied uniformly to everyone. Everyone is equal before the law. The rule of law is a worthy ideal. To the extent that it can be achieved, it allows people to know which actions will and will not get them in trouble with the law. It is also fair in treating all people without discrimination. The first paragraph is a description of the rule of law. Though it describes an ideal and it casts it in positive terms, it does not actually make a case for the ideal. It's not an argument. The second paragraph does provide an argument. No indicator words are used, but the paragraph clearly makes a case for the conclusion that the rule of law is a worthy ideal by offering 2 premises in support of it. Now, for each of the following paragraphs, determine whether it contains an argument. If so, identify the premises and conclusions. Let's start with number 1. We parked at the trailhead and began our hike up Mount Washington, walking through a dense forest. After 2 hours, we reached the halfway point and stopped to eat lunch. Is this an argument? Yes or no? Type in the chat bar. You're correct, my friends. This is not an argument. It's something else. It's an interesting fragment of language, and it's saying a description of something, right? It's describing these events, but it's not an argument. Beautiful. Let's do number 2. It's important to have sturdy boots for this hike because the trail is very rocky. Is number 2 an argument? Yes or no? Folks who answered yes, you are correct, my friends. Why? Why is it an argument? What's one easy way of figuring out that this is an argument, given what we've just said? There's the word because. That's right. There's the word because here. That's an indicator word that we saw a moment ago. Right? Qui, because. Parce que. Why? Well, because the trail is very rocky. We're being given a reason, right? What's another name for the reason that's being given for why you should have sturdy boots? So what comes after the because is what? This stuff here. You got it. It's a premise, right? It's a premise. And of course it's factual. That's perfectly right. The trail being rocky or not, Al, is a thing, whether or not it could be true, right? The proposition you want to check out in the world, whether or not the trail is in fact very rocky. So some fact here, right, is being offered, but because it plays a logical relation, that fact isn't just a fact. It's being put forward as a reason for something further. So it's playing the role of a premise. Do you see that, Al? It is a fact. That's perfectly, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, you want to appeal to facts too. Of course, that's the goal, right? Al, does that make sense? That part over here is the fact, but you're serving it is playing the role of a premise. You want your premises to be factual. That's terrific. That's what we want. Just Lord knows why would you not, right? You want to make a good case for why it's important to have sturdy boots for this hike. You know, you want to give some reasons. Notice, by the way, I could have just said this. Imagine I say this. Let me just erase some of the rest, right? I say it's important to have sturdy boots for this hike, and I just scream it out, exclamation mark. Is this an argument? Yes or no? So number 2, as it currently stands now, as I've reworked it. Is this an argument? Yes or no? You're absolutely correct. It's not an argument, right? This is now just an imperative, right? It's me just saying a command. I'm just saying something really loudly. It's not an argument. It becomes an argument when we ask why, right? Kyung, why? Well, because, and now here we're given a reason, right? Because the trail is very rocky. Now, a good argument or a bad argument is still an argument, but this is an argument, right? You might say, for instance, it's not as good an argument because maybe you don't really necessarily need sturdy boots, whatever, but the point is it's an argument. And Al, I don't want to get bogged down into tiny details, but Al is asking an interesting question. And let me rephrase, let me read what Al said. Why should I argue a fact if the conversation is between me and a friend? Well, you want your friend, you want to offer them reason. Like, you don't often just give orders to your friends, right? Maybe if you're a parent, you might give orders to your child, but typically you don't force people to do what you want. You provide reasons for them, right? And moreover, you know, you want to be able, this could happen between two people, and you want to give reasons for why you're telling someone to wear the sturdy boots, right? And it's not just obvious. For instance, you're not arguing a fact. You're arguing whether or not you bring sturdy boots. That's an open question. And you're hoping that because the person you're talking to is going to agree that the trail is very rocky, that they're also going to agree to your recommendation to bring sturdy boots, as opposed to just shoving it down their throat and screaming. Al, do you see that? You're trying to use their nodding yes to the premise to get them to nod yes to the conclusion. That's what an argument is. You get someone to nod yes to a premise, that gets them to nod yes to the conclusion, if your argument's any good. Al, is that clearer? Again, I don't want to start nitpicking so early in the game. There's no real reason to, but Al, tell me if that's clear. You're mobilizing the fact that the trail is rocky. You get them to nod yes. They go, yes, I agree the trail is very rocky. And you're trying to convert that into them not you know, saying yeah to the sturdy boots. Beautiful. Do the numbered premises affect the argument? No, they don't. We'll see that in a way, Trapajit. Put that on a shelf. My friends, I believe that the earth is round because it casts a round shadow on the moon. Is this an argument, yes or no? And again, there's a really easy way of figuring that out right now, right? Because we have because over here. Right? That's our indicator word. It's reliable. Now notice here, I believe that the earth is round. When you say I believe that, right? What we mean by that is I'm betting that the following is true. That's what it means to have a belief. A belief is you take something, right, and you bet that it's going to be true. Because there's two possibilities. Let's consider what I'm putting in a box here, that the earth is round. It's a proposition. And as far as propositions go, there's two possibilities. It can either be true or it can be false. When you say, I believe that the earth is round, you're saying I'm betting that it's going to come out on the true side, right? So that's what it means to believe something. It's a technical term in philosophy, to believe something. You can't just say, I believe. Like, you believe what? Beliefs are directed at or are about something. And to believe something isn't just to feel really strongly. It's to say you're betting on the truth of the thing that you believe in, right? Now, you could stop there, and that could be interesting. So you can imagine, I'm going to airbrush out of existence the following, right? And you say this, I believe that the earth is round. That's interesting. That tells me something about you. What does it tell me? Well, it tells me namely that you are betting on the fact that the proposition, the earth is round, is going to come out as true. That's interesting. I've learned something about you, but do I or anybody else have any reason to agree with you? Well, not so far, because you haven't given me a reason for why you're betting on the true side of these two possibilities. It could either be true, it could be false. You think it's going to be true. That's wonderful. You believe that. Why? Kyung, Wishama, pourquoi, why? If you give me an answer to that, the why is a request for a reason. If you give me an answer, typically that answer begins with the word because. So I say why, you say because, and then you give me this other thing, which I'm going to put in a box. It casts a round shadow on the moon. When I say it, what am I talking about? What does that word it pick out? The earth, that's right. So you might, if you want extra clarity, right, you can reword, right, this, there you go, the earth, right? And then you have a proposition over here. The earth casts a round shadow on the moon. Now you're hoping that this is going to be a good reason, that anyone else would see that reason to agree with you that the earth is round, to bet also on the true side of that. So you've got yourself an argument. And you have the two parts that we're learning to distinguish. Notice that you have the conclusion, the earth is round, and it's not just asserted, the support is given for it, namely that it casts a round shadow on the moon. And we mentioned to go facts. Well, you want to verify all this stuff. So hopefully, of course, if you put forward a premise, it's got to be a true premise in order to really be a persuasive argument. You don't want to give falsehoods, right? You want to say something, I believe that the earth is round because, and you can say something stupid like because a squirrel told me so. Yeah, the earth is still round, by the way, but that's a horrible reason for thinking that it's round because a squirrel told you so, right? And here you have a reasonable argument with a premise. That's a reasonable one. You can check it out, by the way. Next time we're between the moon and the sun, you'll see that we're going to cast a shadow on the moon. Our earth is going to cast a shadow. Have a look at the shape of that shadow. It turns out to be a round shadow. Baby steps into logic. And we're going to have some really difficult issues down the road, right? Yeah. So the earth is round is a proposition and a conclusion. That's right. Proposition just is a grammatically complete fragment of language. So grammatically complete, right? That's liable of being true or false. So for instance, this is what we mean by proposition. So hold that thought, Arnav. That's a great question. Suppose I write, the earth, true or false? Well, you can't really ask that question. I haven't said anything yet. All I just said, the earth, right? Or imagine I say round. True or false? Well, you can't really ask that question whether it's true or false. I haven't actually yet said anything. Some things are round, some things aren't. So what are we talking about here? What's round? You can't just say round, true or false, right? And you can't just say the earth, true or false, right? Because you can say the earth fits in my pocket. That would be false. And it would still involve the earth, right? So you can't say the earth, true or false. And you can't say round, true or false, because my table is not round. What the hell are you talking about? When you say, however, the earth is round, then you have something that's grammatically complete, and you can see just by reading it out loud that it's liable of being true or false, right? And you can assess that it's a candidate for truth or falsity, even if you can't check whether it's true or false. Let me give you an example. Suppose I write the following. There are an odd number of stars in the universe. Now, even in odd numbers, right? It's like, you know what that means. There's an odd number of stars in the universe. This, my friend, is a proposition. It's either true or it's false. Look, the universe has stars in it, and whatever, it's a finite amount of stars, right? And if you were to count them, it's either an odd or an even number. So this is a proposition. It could be true or it could be false, right? Now, we're in no position to determine the truth or falsity of it, but you can tell that this is definitely a proposition. And a proposition is just that, a grammatically complete sentence that's liable of being true or false. It could be true or false. And then sometimes it plays the role of a conclusion, and sometimes it plays the role of a premise. And those are labels to track its role. Beautiful. That's a technical term for us. Proposition is a technical term, right? Just a grammatically complete sentence that's liable of being true or false. Right? And a proposition with a premise is going to be a conclusion. Yeah, so both of these things are propositions. So again, just to get the nomenclature just right, so Arnav, pause those questions for a second though. This is a proposition. What I'm putting in a box. This is a proposition, but one of these boxes acts as a reason for the other. And then we give additional terminology for that. It's a premise in support of a conclusion, because this box is supposed to get you to agree to that box. And so we call the box that's acting as a premise, we call that a premise. That's the reason for accepting what's in the box in green. All right? Arnav, is that clear? And again, some of this stuff's in the reading we just read. So if you read it again carefully, it's all in there. All right. Here's another situation. Sandra's afraid of cats. She was bit by a cat once. My friends, this is an argument. But notice now, it's a little trickier. right? We have propositions once again. So going back to the terminology that we just introduced a moment ago, Sandra is afraid of cats. Well, that could either be true or it could be false, right? Maybe she's not afraid of cats. Maybe she is. So it's a proposition. It's grammatically complete and it's liable of being true or false. She was bit by a cat once. And by she here, we mean Sandra. Again, that's a proposition, right? Maybe she was bit by a cat once and maybe she wasn't. So it could be true, it could be false, but it's a proposition. So we got two propositions, right? But we have no indicator words. We have no indicator words. Still, it's an argument. What is the conclusion of this argument? And again, it's okay if we make mistakes, but let's give it the old college try. That Sandra is afraid of cats, folks are saying. Right? Okay, let's try that. Suppose I say, Sandra's afraid of the cats. I'm going to ask you, which word goes more naturally here? You got it, right? Because she was bit by a cat once. All right, cool. So Sandra's afraid of cats because she was bit by a cat once. Like the order of fit here is crucially important, right? And so what that means is Sandra's afraid of cats is the conclusion and she was bit by a cat once. That's the premise, right? It's the reason given for why we ought to agree that Sandra is afraid of cats. Our baby steps into logic are moving forward. And notice how it's a slightly more difficult example because we have no indicator words, right? But there's still a logical relation there between these two propositions. A humidifier would help my congestion. A humidifier would be good for my wooden floors. I should buy a humidifier. What's the main point of this? What's the conclusion? What's the point that the person's trying to make? Arguments are trying to establish something. They're trying to make a point. They're trying to prove something. What are they trying to prove here? What are they trying to establish? What's the point? Yeah, that you need a humidifier, right? That you should buy a humidifier. Not that it would help with not that it would help with your congestion, right? That you should buy a humidifier. Why should you buy a humidifier? How many reasons are given for why you should buy a humidifier? How many reasons? That's right. 2 reasons are given, right? 2 reasons. One of the reasons is, that's first premise over here, a humidifier would help with your congestion. The other reason is that a humidifier would be good for my wooden floors, and I should buy a humidifier. Notice, by the way, this is not necessarily a conversation between 2 people. This could easily be a person sitting and thinking for themselves, right? I should buy a humidifier. That's a thought that occurs to them, but it's been prompted by considerations of other things, namely that a humidifier would help with their congestion, and a humidifier would be good for their wooden floors. It's not necessarily a conversation between 2 people. You can have arguments that are just pieces of reasoning in your own mind, right? You can come to the conclusion that you should buy a humidifier, and if you've come to the conclusion that you should buy a humidifier, then that was a process of reasoning. And that process of reasoning means it was pivoting on certain reasons. And hopefully they're true reasons, right? Hopefully it's true that it would help with your congestion. And hopefully it's true that it would be good for your wooden floors. But the bottom line is, we're not just saying I should buy a humidifier, right? Because someone could just as well say, right, you should buy a humidifier, for instance, and not give you any reasons, right? And then let's say they just put an exclamation mark here, right? And there's none of these reasons given. Well, you can totally do that. And maybe you should buy a humidifier. But that's a very different status than actually providing reasons why. Like a good salesperson will provide you reasons for why you ought to agree with whatever it is they're trying to sell you, right? Likewise for reasons and arguments, right? We want to give reasons for why you should agree. Good. We should hang him. He is guilty. That's an argument. What's the conclusion? We should hang him. That's right. And again, have fun. Ask yourself the following, right? And again, if you make mistakes in the chat bar, that's fine and productive, because I want to think about that a little bit for a moment, right? What would you put here? Would you put because, or would you put therefore? Should we say we should hang him, therefore he's guilty, or we should hang him because he is guilty? Clearly, we want to say because, right? And notice this is vital, by the way. Like, if you think of this argument, look, you got 2 propositions, right? And the propositions can have one relation or the other with each other. It could go this way, right? And it could go this way. One of these is just, and the other is massively unjust. Like imagine, for instance, I say, we should hang him, right? Therefore, he's guilty. Let's say I say therefore, that's this T over here, let's say that's therefore, and I go for this top arrow, we should hang him, therefore he's guilty. You have a witch trial on your hands. That's the biggest perversion of justice you could possibly have. First, you decide to hurt someone, and then you say, the fact that I want to hurt them is proof of their guilt. It's like, whoa, man, that's like wrong. It's so bad wrong, right? The reverse is a just system, right? Clearly, there's more to be said. You can be guilty and not necessarily want to hang someone. So this argument, you'd want to keep asking why quite a bit. But the point is, if someone says we should hang him, once again, if they just scream out we should hang him, right, and they don't give you any reasons, they're not giving you an argument, right? However, if you say, why? Pourquoi? Right? And then they say he is guilty, they've given you a reason. Now, the reason he is guilty, that's a proposition, so that means it could be true and it could be false. Just like there's an odd number of stars in the universe, that could be true and that could be false. And of course, you're hoping that it's true, and then you have to go check. And that's why we have trials. You want to establish the truth of this proposition. But even if it were a false proposition, this is still an argument. Even if he's not guilty, this fragment of language over here, that is still an argument. It's an argument that's unfortunately using a false premise, right? But nevertheless, it's an argument in virtue of its logical structure. And notice also the word why, right? We talked about the word why. So we should hang him. You say, okay, why? I'm going to put a question mark here. So why? And then someone gives you a reason, and you say guilt because he's guilty. You can keep asking, right? So you want to say, why is he guilty? And then what you want is further reasons, right? So it's not like there's an end to this. You can keep pushing and pushing by asking why, until you reach a point where you're satisfied, and then the truth of whatever satisfied you, right, would lend its support to all of the other reasons that were given, right, and presumably then support the conclusion that we should hang him, right, however the case may be. All right, laser eye surgery is getting cheaper, and cheaper goods have greater appeal. Thus, laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. This is an argument. What is the conclusion of this argument? Laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. That's correct. And why is that the correct answer? So you're right. That's the correct answer. The conclusion is laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. Why is that the correct answer? What's some easy way for us to figure it out? Armand Jutt writes, thus. That's right. Thus is an indicator word. It's telling us that we're now, like drum roll please, this is the culmination of why I was talking about laser eye surgery and so on, right? Because you can have a situation where you start talking about whatever you want to talk about, right? Laser eye surgery is getting cheaper and cheaper goods have greater appeal. If you just said this, for instance, right? Well, that's interesting, but you don't still have an argument. You're just talking about stuff. You're describing a situation about laser eye surgery and cheap goods. But when you say thus, you're inferring from that something further, right? Something follows logically from that, namely that laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. And notice now that if you were to ask why of the conclusion, right? So if you move in the opposite direction and you ask why, you're given reasons. Because again, someone could just say the following, right? Notice, I'm going to airbrush all of this out of existence, and I say laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. It's a proposition. It's grammatically complete. Could be true, could be false, but we're not given a reason for believing in it. Clearly, if you say it, typically the mere fact of asserting something means you believe in it. That is, you're betting on its truth. We don't go around saying things we don't believe to be true. Typically, when we speak, it's because we believe it's true. Like if I say it's raining, well, it's because I believe it's raining, right? I don't bother saying I'm committed to the truth of the proposition that it's raining. When we speak, the act of speaking typically signals our endorsement. Someone says laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. Fair enough, man, but you're not conclusion yet because you're not given a reason for why you should agree. And of course, in philosophy and in everywhere else in life, we want to ask why. Why should I or anybody else agree? And here you're given some reasons. Namely that laser eye surgery is getting cheaper and cheaper goods have greater appeal. Therefore, thus, escarque, par conséquent, laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. And Arnav, no, you could not reverse the conclusions because it would make it silly. Let's have fun with that for just a second, right? Imagine, for instance, if I were to flip it around and I'd say, laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing, therefore it's getting cheaper. How's that work out? If you know anything about supply and demand, I'm actually violating supply and demand if you do that, right? And so you can't flip it around. Arnav, do you see that? It would make no sense. It'd be a horrible argument. You could still see the word because, right? But it wouldn't make it a good argument. Yeah. By the way, I can say because whatever I want. So let me just hold on for a second here. I want to have some fun here and riff on something. And like I said, Arnav, we don't want to get into fine details right away. These are just baby steps. But imagine I say the following: I'm going to make a set of propositions, and all of them are going to be true, but we're going to have some fun. All right. Notice here we've got true propositions. The sky is blue. They all happen to be true, right? Humans have blood. That happens to be true. The earth is round. That also happens to be true. But there is no logical relation that's leading one to the other, right? And so even if you have an indicator word, this would be a horrible argument, right? And it's horrible because there's no actual logical relation between those things. So you need a little more for an argument to happen, right? And you can't just switch it around. Yeah, you can see that. And again, have fun with this. This is important, by the way. And you'll see this for the homework, Arnav and everybody else. If you're unsure about something, take out a piece of paper and experiment. So for instance, if you're not 100% clear on what's the premise and what's the conclusion, why don't you try both possibilities? Look, there's only two possibilities. One of them is because, and the other is therefore. Why don't you read both out loud and let your normal common sense intuitions kick in to tell you what's the direction of fit? It's no problem if you go around and you play around with these Tetris blocks and to see how they lock together or not. Experiment. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay? It's not like you're able to see these logical relations at a glance. Here's a proof. Let's do a larger specimen here. You should work fewer hours. Since your family has paid a great deal of money for your education, you should take your schoolwork more seriously. And every hour spent working is an hour not spent doing schoolwork. Therefore, you should stop working so much. This is an argument. What's the conclusion of this argument? Take the time to read it. Think a bit. What's the main point? What's the point this person trying to make? What's the point of this argument? What's it trying to prove? Javitesh says you should stop working so much. Yeah. Last sentence. And again, what's a no-brainer for this? And it's not stop working, it's work less, by the way. So Muskan Preet, watch out. We don't want to change. There's an important scope here, right? We don't want to say something stronger than it's actually saying. It's not saying you should stop working. So it's saying you should work less. That's a big difference, right? There's a big difference. The word therefore, right? Look at the word therefore. That's an indicator word, right? Therefore, you should stop working so much. What about this? You should work fewer hours. Compare this. You should stop working. You should work fewer hours. Notice it's the same thing. They're saying the same thing again. These are propositions spelled out differently, right? The conclusion shows up at the beginning of this argument, right? And at the end. At the beginning and at the end. It's fine for something to show up twice. It's still the same logical role. You could easily imagine this argument, right? Could have removed this, and you'd have the same argument, right? You should work fewer hours. Why? Because your family has paid a great deal. And since, by the way, is also an indicator word, right? We talked about indicator words. We had our little box there earlier, right? Since, that's an indicator word. Remember, it could be used temporally. Like, since I was a young boy, I always liked hockey, whatever, right? Since. But now we're using it as a premise indicator. So since your family's paid a great deal of money. And notice once again that you could just say, you should work fewer hours. Like you could easily imagine, let's say that could be your parents, and it could tell you something like this and order you to work fewer hours. And they'd be giving you a command. But commands aren't arguments because they're not offering you any reasons. So if someone said you should work fewer hours, they're not giving you an argument. So this is not a conclusion, right? If, however, you ask, why should I work fewer hours? And they have, the respect to actually give you reasons, they're offering you reasons. And those reasons are here in green. Namely that your family's paid a great deal of money for your education. You should take your schoolwork more seriously. And every hour spent working is an hour not spent doing schoolwork, right? Now, I want you to look at this argument once again. Notice it's a fairly larger passage. We're moving our way up from the smaller specimens to something larger. Imagine that, just look at this part right now. Forget the rest. Since your family's paid a great deal of money for your education, you should take your schoolwork more seriously. What are we looking at? What's the technical term for the whole thing in black that we're looking at right now? What are we looking at? What is this? Since your family's paid a great deal of money for your education, you should take your schoolwork more seriously. It's a form of reasoning. And what's the technical word for it? Jai Vitesh, you got it. It's an argument. We're looking at an argument, my friends. Right? There's an argument inside this argument. You have this argument over here, but inside the premises, right? It's like argument inception, right? You have the sandwich here with the conclusion at the beginning, the reasons, and then a reiteration of the conclusion. But even within the sandwich, right, you've got an argument. If an argument has a premise and a conclusion, then in this instance, what's the conclusion of this argument in black? What's the conclusion? What's it trying to convince you of? That you should take your schoolwork more seriously. Sapandeep, you got it. The second sentence, right? It's actually, the whole thing is a sentence, right? But it's got two propositions. So sentence and proposition, by the way, are technical terms, right? That you should take your schoolwork more seriously, right? Why? So again, you could just say flat out, right, without necessarily arguing, you could just say, you should take, whoops, ooh, that's really a fat pencil. You should take your schoolwork more seriously and not offer any reasons, right? But here, someone's offering reasons. What are their reasons? Well, because your family's paid a great deal of money for your education, right? So what we have here is an argument. And it's an argument, interestingly, that's within an argument. So just to go show you how these things can easily become complicated, and that's why our baby steps aren't going to stay baby steps for very long. As the semester progresses, we're going to be handling very complicated argument structures, and you're going to have to track all of that, right? And notice I've put in black here the since. That's an indicator word. It's a premise indicator, right? So you might say, you should take your schoolwork more seriously. Why? Because your family's paid a great deal of money for your education. And if you went the opposite way, you might say, your family's paid a great deal of money for your education, therefore, you should take your schoolwork more seriously. Here you can insert the word therefore, right? Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. And again, if all of these things aren't apparent at a first approach, that's okay. It's an introductory class. You're starting out. You've just been doing this for an hour. Practice makes perfect, or at least it makes better. Good. All right, so we're continuing our reading. This was kind of we took the time to look at some distinctions here because we were looking at the distinction between premise and conclusions. We did that. Let's look now at the distinction between dependent and independent relations of support, because those are the two things that we want to master today. So let's continue our reading together. Is everyone still good to go? If you're good to go, tell me good to go. I'm going to stretch here. I'm going to take another stretch because I'm going to put on my audiobook voice. We're good to go. We're loving it. We're doing this. Let's do this. All right, let's continue our reading. We can think of the premises as the raw materials for an argument and the conclusion as the final product. To understand an argument, we need to know what happens in between, on the factory floor, so to speak. We need to analyze the inner workings of the argument and the individual steps that lead from the premises to the conclusion. Once we've analyzed the argument, we can go on to evaluate it. Is it a good argument? Does it provide good reasons to accept the conclusion? We'll begin with analysis in this section. So the first thing we want to do is just understand arguments. We can't even ask the question of whether or not they're good or bad unless we even know what we're talking about. To analyze an argument, we can use a diagramming method that employs just two symbols but is flexible enough to handle arguments of any complexity. One symbol is an arrow pointing from premise to conclusion. This arrow represents a single step in reasoning, the relationship between a premise and the conclusion. Suppose you argued against gun control on the ground that it would violate the right of self-defense. Then your reasoning could be diagrammed as follows. Premise, restricting handgun ownership violates the right of self-defense. Therefore, that's what this arrow is. It means therefore, the government should not restrict handgun ownership. This is an extremely simple argument. It has a single premise and there's a single step in the reasoning. So the structure of the argument is fully represented by a single arrow. Now, importantly, when we read this, we can read it two ways, by the way. Notice that this arrow here is very crucial for us. If we read it going down, if you read it from the top going to the bottom, right, what you're going to say is, when you see the arrow, you're going to say therefore. right? So when you go like this, you see, read out the premise, therefore the conclusion. But you can also go in the opposite direction and read from the bottom up. And in fact, part of the skill that I want you to practice over the next 2 weeks is to always practice reading in both directions. And the way you do that is to say, when you're reading on the way up, you say, why? Because, dot, dot, dot. So let's just say because, right? That's a horrible because. I've got my E on the other side. There you go, right? So why? Because, let me put my E over here. And then you've got your reason that's given, offered in support of that. So the arrow is a technical notation that we're going to be using. And importantly, we don't want to say arrow when we read it. That's not helpful. What is arrow? Like, who cares, right? What does that arrow stand for? It stands for a logical relation, the most elementary of them all, namely the passage from a premise to a conclusion, or from a conclusion to a premise, right? So if you're reading downward, you say, restricting handgun ownership violates the right of self-defense. Therefore, escarque, the government should not restrict handgun ownership. If you're reading from the bottom up, and you got to go both ways, you'd say, the government should not restrict handgun ownership. Because, why? Because restricting handgun ownership violates the right of self-defense. This is really important. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you got a question, ask your question. Because who cares about arrows, right? I mean, the arrow is an important logical notation, but the word arrow itself is not informative. So we really want to supplant that with what it actually stands for. Beautiful. All right, let's keep reading our reading. So I want to keep this on screen right now. Let's keep reading our reading. I just want to do a brief pause. But what if there's more than one premise? Then we have a decision to make. In some cases, the premises are dependent on one another. Two or more premises work together to make a single argument for a conclusion. In other cases, the premises are independent. They do not work together. Each one offers a separate line of support for the conclusion. These two patterns are diagrammed in different ways, so we have to decide which pattern is present in a given argument. To illustrate the distinction, let's re-examine two arguments that we already discussed. The first is Ronald Reagan's argument about politics and religion. In essence, if you recall, he said, 1, politics depends on morality, and 2, morality depends on religion. Therefore, 3, politics depends on religion. This argument illustrates the first pattern, an argument with dependent premises. Premises 1 and 2 must be combined in order to have an argument for 3. The premise that politics depends on morality, taken by itself, doesn't tell us anything about religion. So it doesn't give us any reason to think that politics depends on religion. In the same way, the premise that morality depends on religion, taken by itself, does not tell us anything about politics. So again, we would have no reason to think politics depends on religion. It's only when we put the premises together that we have an argument. We represent this fact by using a second symbol, the plus sign, to join the premises. Using the numbers to stand for the individual propositions, we would diagram the argument like this. And again, you don't want to say 1 plus 2 equals 3. What you want to do is as follows, right? So let me zoom back out here so that we can see what those numbers stand for. 1, that's a shorthand for a proposition, namely that politics depends on morality. So as you point these things and you read them out, read out what they stand for. You say politics depends on morality, and morality depends on religion. Therefore, politics depends on religion. And again, you want to work the other way around from the bottom up. You'll say 3, for instance, will be politics depends on religion. Why? Because politics depends on morality, and morality depends on religion. It's very, very important that you not treat these things, just like we don't want to treat the arrows as just an arrow. We want to treat it as therefore or why because. This plus here, you want to say and it's a logical and that requires the collaboration of the two premises. So we use a single arrow drawn from a line joining the premises to represent the fact that the premises together make up a single argument. By contrast, consider the argument about the rule of law. In this case, the conclusion is stated first, so we give it the number 1. So the numbering here is just first come, first serve. The first thing that shows up, you name it 1. In diagramming arguments, it does not matter how we number the premises and conclusions so long as we give each proposition its own number. So it's easiest to number them in the order that they're stated. Here's the argument. The rule of law is a worthy ideal to the extent that it can be achieved. 2, it allows people to know which actions will and will not get them into trouble with the law. 3, it is also fair in treating all people without discrimination. This argument illustrates the second pattern. Premises 2 and 3 independently support the conclusion. If the rule of law allows people to know the legal consequences of their actions, as stated in 2, that gives us some reason to think the rule of law is a worthy ideal, regardless of whether it's also fair. And the fairness of the rule of law, as stated in 3, provides a reason for considering it a worthy ideal, regardless of premise 2. So in diagramming this argument, we don't use the plus sign. We use 2 arrows to join each premise of the conclusion separately. And again, this is important because you're able, given this logical structure, to imagine this argument on its own. So let me just grab myself a marker here. You can imagine this argument on its own. And likewise, you can imagine this argument on its own without this one existing, and it would still make sense. So there's 2 reasons offered in support, and those reasons stand or fall independent of the other reason. Now, to tell whether a set of premises is dependent or independent, we have to look at each premise separately and ask whether the kind of support it offers to the conclusion depends on the other premises. A good way to do this is to suppose that the other premises are unknown or even false. If that would significantly affect the logical impact of the premise in question, then the relationship among the premises is one of mutual dependence, and a plus sign should be used in the diagram. In contrast, if the premise in question would still give us a reason for accepting the conclusion, then it is independent of the other premises and should be diagrammed with a separate arrow. The goal is to put together those premises that form a single line of thought and separate them from premises that represent distinct lines of thought. But this is not always easy. As we learn more about specific types of argument, we'll learn more about what sorts of premises must be combined to support a conclusion. So let's practice a little bit. Remember this argument? A humidifier would help my congestion. A humidifier would be good for my wooden floors. Therefore, I should buy a humidifier. Does everyone remember that argument? Type in yes if you remember it. No if you don't. Let's get you active because we're going to work together. Beautiful. All right. So remember we had this argument, and earlier the task was just to separate the premises from the conclusion. So our first order of business, right, was just to realize that I should buy a humidifier. That was the conclusion. And we are offered 2 reasons for it. Now, we have a further choice to make now. Since we've got more than one premise, we have to ask, are the premises collaborating to support the conclusion, or are they independent from one another? Well, in this case, they're doing it independently. Let's imagine the situation that follows. Let's imagine I take my airbrush here. I'm going to airbrush out the following. Let's call premise number 2 here. Let's remove that. Let's just take out this premise, and let's go like this. Now the diagram represents only what's on there in language. A humidifier would help my congestion. Therefore, I should buy a humidifier. Does that make sense? Yes or no? I'm giving you a reason for buying a humidifier. It'd be good for your congestion. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. That could totally happen on its own, right? But suppose I really want to convince you, so I'll give you 2 reasons. Then I say, and you know what? Also, it would be good for your wooden floors. Well, let's imagine, for instance, that you're not sick. So I'm going to take my airbrush once again, and I'm going to remove this, right? You don't have congestion. You're perfectly healthy. But you know what? You've got wooden floors in your apartment, right? And I want to get you to buy a humidifier. And I say, well, a humidifier would be good for my wooden floors. Therefore, I should buy a humidifier. Does that make sense on its own? Yes or no? Like, it's good for your floors. Buy a humidifier. Totally. It makes sense on its own. So there you go. You have a reason here for diagramming this as a relation of independent support, right? You could have easily a situation where you don't have congestion, but you have wooden floors. And that would still lend support to buying a humidifier. And you could also have a situation where you have a congestion nose, but you don't even have a wooden floors. Let's say it's, I don't know, vinyl or something, right? And it's still a good reason to buy your humidifier. In this case now, what we do is to disambiguate what sort of logical support the premises are lending to the conclusion, we use these two arrows going this way, right? And that's the diagram that we're going to be using for that. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. And we're doing great, by the way. So we're learning these basic conceptual distinctions, and then we're going to compound them to more and more complicated arguments, but we got to get clear on the basic ingredients. Here's an example now of a relation of dependent support. So notice once again, just for simplicity, I put the conclusion at the end, although we've seen that the conclusion could be at the beginning. It doesn't matter how in language it shows up, right? And I say here, this omelet contains iron. Why? Because, and here's a situation where we've got two premises, but they have to collaborate. Notice here, premise number one is that spinach contains iron. There's nothing in here that talks about omelets. Do you agree? The line I've put in blue. Anything about omelets, yes or no? Spinach contains iron. Any mention of omelets, eggs? Like there's no mention of omelets at all, yet the conclusion has to do with omelets containing iron. Like there's talk of omelets in there. So you got yourself a problem. If you have a situation like this, right? And all of a sudden you try to say, well, I'm going to go from the premise that spinach contains iron to the conclusion that this omelet contains iron, you can't logically go from that premise to the conclusion. You skipped a step there. Likewise, if you imagine this and you remove this mention of spinach containing iron, and you try to go logically from the premise that this omelet contains spinach to this omelet containing iron, you're assuming already that spinach contains iron. In order to move from that premise to that conclusion logically, you need, in addition, a premise to the effect that spinach contains iron. And so here you have a case where the premises lend support to the conclusion dependently. They have to be represented with this plus sign over here, this and. And it's a very demanding logical and, right? It's a logical and here because you can't have one without the other, right? They both need to work together to support this conclusion that omelet contains iron. And one easy way of figuring that out, like I said, is to look at the concepts. Here you have the concept of omelet. Here you have the concept of omelet. And we can have fun color coding it, right? Here you have the concept of iron. Here you have the concept of iron. And I'm going to use spinach. Well, luckily I've got green, spinach, and spinach, right? The green connects with the blue. The green connects with the purple. And by transitivity, right, the purple connects with the blue. And you have to have these relations together in order for the argument to be supported by the premises, so the conclusion be supported by the premises. That's the basic vocabulary, those two relations, dependent, independent. Let's practice some more. Lagos is in Nigeria. Nigeria is in Africa. And Lagos is in Africa. Lagos, whatever, I'm probably mispronouncing it. Let's have some fun with this. Let's imagine premise number one. And imagine you don't even know anything about geography. Does anyone know about Lagos, Nigeria, all that stuff? It's actually helpful not to know. It's actually, strangely enough, it's helpful not to know. I'm going to have fun here, right? I'm going to remove all these names, right? And I'm just going to call it N, L, and A. N, L, and A. I'm going to have some fun. Because sometimes our knowledge of geography is going to make us worse logicians. And when we do logic, we want to suspend the question of the truth or falsehood of the claims and just look at their logical relations. Now, according to my airbrushing, what I'm saying is that I'm saying that L is in N is in A, and L is in A. Let me have some fun with this and make a diagram like a funny shoe boxes. Let's have some shoe boxes. Imagine I call this box over here. Let me make it a little thinner. Imagine I call this box over here, L is in N. So I'm going to have some fun. L is in N. Do we agree I've captured this first premise? L is in N. Containment relation, right? L is in N. I've put the L box inside the N box. Okay, so we're going to take baby steps in this so you can verify whether I did that right. So there's box L and there's box N. Did I do that correctly? First premise, L is in N. Right? My friends, verify. Did I do everything right? L is in N. Just do that one premise. Cool. All right. L is in N. Beautiful. Let's do premise number two. Premise number two says that N is in A. Okay, cool. N is in A. So I'm going to make myself another box, right? And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to call this A. Have I captured premise number 2? N is in A. So I've put the box N inside box A. Did I do that right? Envy, thank you. All right. Now what's my conclusion? L is in A. Is the conclusion true? L is in A? Is that correct or incorrect? Look at the diagram right now on the board. It's correct. L is in A. This is a logical argument. It's a logical argument. That means the truth of its premises is going to carry over to the truth of its conclusion. So given that it's a logical argument, right, the truth of the first premise and the truth of the second premise is going to oblige the truth of the third premise, namely that L is in A. Now notice we go back here. Oh, it turns out it's about geography. But it's not about geography. It's about logic. It has nothing to do with your knowledge of geography. It's just logic. Now, these premises, do they have to collaborate? Are they dependent or independent? In order to support this conclusion, are they dependent or independent? These two premises. Are they dependent or independent? Dependent or independent? Clearly, they're dependent, and you can see that. And I've taken the time to have fun with this one, right? Just to show you how, in order to support the conclusion, you really do need the two to interlock with one another. All right? Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you got a question, ask your question. And again, I'm going beyond the textbook here with some really clear, I'm trying to clear exercises, right? Just to show you so you can really sink your teeth into these logical relations. Beautiful. All right. Japan has a thriving electronics industry. Any country with a thriving electronics industry is wealthy. Therefore, Japan is wealthy. Take your time. Are the premises offering dependent or independent support for the conclusion? Japan has a thriving electronics industry. Any country with a thriving electronics industry is wealthy. Therefore, Japan is wealthy. You are correct, my friends. A relation of dependent support. And again, you could have fun with the concepts here, right? You could say this talks about Japan, right? And it talks about electronics, the electronics industry. The second premise talks about an electronics industry. So I'm going to use the same color. And it also talks about wealthy. That's let's pick another color. Let's go orange, right? Is wealthy. And then finally, the conclusion is talking about Japan. Let's go back to using blue. Talks about Japan. And it talks about wealthy. Let's go back to the same color coding. And notice that they have to interlock in order to have a combination about Japan and wealthy together, right? And another way of doing it, apart from what I've just done by stringing together the concepts, is to imagine one without the other. So let's imagine that I airbrush out of existence. And I'm showing you here ways of testing whether or not these things are dependent or independent support. Suppose I say, for instance, right, I airbrush the first premise out and I say, any country with a thriving electronics industry is wealthy. Therefore, Japan is wealthy. Logically, I can't move from that premise to the conclusion. I can't move to that because I have to assume that Japan happens to have a thriving electronics industry. You can imagine if this was another country that you didn't know anything about, you'd be like, well, I can't possibly go there. It's your prior knowledge of Japan that has to be made explicit in this first premise, namely that Japan has a thriving electronics industry. So strangely enough, sometimes the more you know facts and trivia, the harder it is for you to see the logical relations because you kind of take them for granted, but they have to be spelled out in an argument. Superman has superhuman abilities. That's the conclusion. Why? Because he has X-ray vision and he can fly. Dependent or independent support? How many superhuman abilities, you got it, independent support. How many superhuman abilities must a person have, right, in order to like how many things you have to be able to do in order to be a superhero? How many superhuman abilities do you need? Like if I say he's a superhero, like what do you need? You need one, right? Like think about it, Superman, if he only had the ability to fly, let's just airbrush premise number one out of existence. Let's just remove it, right? Let's imagine that all he can do is fly. By the way, lots of superheroes, that's all they can do. Angel from X-Men, that's all he can do. He can just fly, right? He has superhuman abilities. It only takes one, right? Let's imagine also another situation where he only has X-ray vision. Oh, let's not take away my conclusion. He only has X-ray vision, right? He still has superhuman abilities. So even if you have a situation like this, where all he has is X-ray vision, he still has superhuman abilities. In fact, Superman's got lots of powers. Like if you know anything about superheroes, Superman is way more than just like the ability to fly and have X-ray vision. What else does Superman have? Well, he has X-ray vision. Superman is super strong. Superman is, in the case of Superman, he's like if you have heat vision, like you're Cyclops from X-Men, like that's your claim to fame. You can do one of the many things Superman can do. He's got freeze breath, right? He can do all of these things. And notice it's overkill. Now I'm giving you lots of reason for accepting the claim that Superman has superhuman abilities. You only need one, and so all of these are adding independent support. All right. Laser eye surgery is getting cheaper, and cheaper goods have greater appeal. Therefore, laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing. Dependent or independent support? You got it. Dependent support. Right? You got it. You're getting good at this. Let's do some more practice, right? So there you go. And I've given you, by the way, the slides you're seeing right now, I've given you a bunch of drills. Slides like these that you can go through. It's a PDF file, and you just do page down. You notice how here you have kind of like the question, and on the next page you have the solution, right? You can do that. It's going to be available on Moodle as soon as we're done with today's class, and you can practice. It's a little drill, and I recommend you do it. And if you screw up, by the way, and you get the wrong answer, because look, it's 50-50 chance. You could toss a coin. It's either dependent or independent support. I've kept it really simplified, just two premises, one conclusion. Go back and try to understand why it is the way it is. And notice I'm taking time here to explain to you how you test whether it's dependent or independent support. And what you do is you try to assume one without the other. So for instance, here, the way to test it would be airbrush out of existence one of these premises and see if it logically supports the conclusion, right? So for instance, imagine I say just this. So I airbrush out of existence the second premise. Can I move from the first premise to the conclusion? Well, not really, right? There's a logical gap here. I'm talking about getting cheaper, and all of a sudden I'm talking about being appealing. I've kind of switched the topic, right? And the same will happen also if you blurt out of existence the first premise, right? And you try to say, can I logically move from the premise to the conclusion? And I'm talking about cheaper goods. And I can't infer from that that laser eye surgery is becoming more appealing, because that presumes that laser eye surgery is cheaper. That's not at all obvious, so you can't move that way. Okay, so that's going to require some practice and training. It's a skill. Let's go back to our text now. All right. For each of the following arguments, you're given a structure of the argument, right? No, Charan, that's why we have recording. So we're going to keep moving forward, but you can go ahead and watch the recording. Is that good? Just watch the recording again. The Africa one? Yeah, that's why we have recordings. That's really cool, right? So if there was something that we did, neat, no problem. All right, fill in the numbers at the appropriate places. So again, here you have an example where the arguments have been already numbered for you. And the numbering, is there anything specific about the number one that tells us whether it's a conclusion or a premise? Is the number one important, yes or no? Like, does it pick out any particular logical role? What does number one pick out? Why is this called number one here? I shouldn't go home this weekend, blah, blah, blah. Why is that called number one? Why do we number this one? What's the reason for numbering this one? Why one? We said this a moment ago in the reading. How do we number these things? Like why one, why two, why three? Like in what guides us that choice of numbering? Why is it called one? Why is the first thing called one, the second thing called two, and the third thing called three? Does that mean it's a premise because it's one? Or does that mean it's a conclusion because it's one? What guides us in numbering these things? No, it's not math, Armanjot. That's not at all it. It's not at all 1 + 2 = 3, not even close. No, it's not because it's a conclusion. No, it's not because it's a proposition. I'm glad I'm asking this because I want to check with you, make sure you're following and that you captured that nuance. Is really important. No, don't, because it helps you clarify statements. No, well, it spares you from rewriting them, Emily, so that's true. No, we write it number one just because it's one. It's the first one that shows up. No, not the word because. So everyone's going on the wrong track. So I'm glad I checked in with you. The reason why this is numbered the way it is is just because that's the first proposition that showed up was numbered number 1. The second proposition that shows up is numbered number 2. The third thing that shows up is numbered number 3. Okay, there's no real reason beyond that. It's just first come, first serve. 1, slice. 2, slice. 3, slice. You cut it into pieces and you number them in the order in which the text presents itself. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear, because we really want to be sure about that. Otherwise, you'll be super confused, right? If you think there's something magical about 1 and 2 and 3, if you think there's something there that tells you something, you're going to be like all mistaken. All right, cool. So the only reason why this is called number 1 is because it showed up first. I shouldn't go home this weekend, not only because I have too much studying to do, but also because I can't afford the trip. What should I put where I put this question mark? What's the conclusion of this argument? What number should I pop in there? Agreed. I shouldn't go home this weekend. That's number 1. I shouldn't go home this weekend. Why? Because, and here obviously by process of elimination, it's really easy to figure out. The structure's been given for you. Because I have too much studying to do, but also because I can't afford the trip. And notice the but also, it's like in addition, right? But you can also use the word and here, right? And if I use the word and, notice that in English, I'd have to say the word and, but you can't say that because you use the word and, that there would be this plus sign here. No. Often you can use the word and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a logically dependent relation. Let me give you an example. Let's go back to Superman, right? Look, what is this saying? It's saying Superman has heat vision, and Superman has freeze breath, and Superman has X-ray vision, and Superman can fly, and Superman is super strong. Therefore, Superman has superhuman abilities. Notice that when I was speaking it, I used the word and, but it's not like I'm representing these things with a plus in between. There's no plus. There's no logical plus there. There's no logical conjunction is what we want to say, right? So it isn't because you find the word and that there necessarily is going to have a relation of dependent support. So if you go over here, the but also easily could have been replaced by and. So I shouldn't go home this weekend, not only because I have too much studying, but you could say this, right? I shouldn't go home this weekend because I have too much studying to do and because I can't afford the trip. That would still be the exact same argument diagram beneath. Even if you made these cosmetic changes and you change the wording such that you remove this this whole thing about not only because, right, all this other stuff, you remove this, right, and you change the but also to an and, it would capture the exact same bloody argument. And you could also then repeat the conclusion, therefore, I shouldn't go home this weekend. You could put it at the end. Is that clear, everyone? Can you see that? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. Can't just use and say, oh, wow, it's and, so we're going to have dependent support. Doesn't work that way. It's like, you should buy a Kia. Why? Because it has good fuel mileage, and it has a great cup holder, and the color is really cool, and it's a safe car, and it's cheap. Those are all different reasons for buying a Kia, by the way. If I'm a salesperson, like there's nothing about like the cup holder that has to do with its color or the mileage. Like it's just like a bunch of ands, but they're not logical ands. Beautiful. All right, let's keep moving. Cheating on schoolwork is wrong because it's dishonest. Someone tell me, what should I put in the following spot? Let me grab myself my little marker here. Let me give myself a really cool color. What should I put as the main conclusion? What should I put over here? What number should I put? Cheating on schoolwork is wrong because it is dishonest. Agreed. 1 over here. Why? Well, look, man. This is the difference between religion and philosophy, right? Religions will tell you cheating on schoolwork is wrong, but never really offer you a reason. In philosophy, we want to ask why. Like if I come face to face with God and God says, you shouldn't kill, the first thing I'm going to ask is why. Or God says, you shouldn't X, Y, Z. I don't care what he or she says. I'm going to ask why, because I'm a philosopher. I want reasons, right? And if God gives me a great reason, then I'm going to agree, but not because God said so, because the reason was good. Well, cheating on schoolwork is wrong. Okay, I want a reason. Why? Because it's dishonest. I'm given a reason, and the reason shows up at the top. That's the premise over here, number 2. All right. Very easy little exercises to practice on, but over the next 2 weeks when you do your homework, things are going to get much harder. Cheating on schoolwork is wrong because it means relying on someone else's knowledge, whereas the purpose of education is to learn how to rely on your own knowledge. What should I put over here as my main conclusion? Agreed. You got that. You're correct. 1. And we don't want to do this 2 plus 1, all this stuff, right? Just answer the one question I'm asking, because otherwise it'll get confusing. Remember, we're using numbers, but is this math? Yes or no? We're using numbers, but is this math? Yes or no? It is not math. You got to be ultra clear about this. It's not math. Because what do the numbers stand for? Like if you're doing math, right? And we do this stands for quantities. And from this, you can infer further quantities because the numbers actually stand for something. But in this case, when we have a bunch of numbers, the numbers don't stand for quantities. They stand for propositions. So proposition 1 here stands for cheating on schoolwork is wrong. And the way we test whether we got this right is we say out loud, we don't say 1. When we read this out, we say cheating on schoolwork is wrong. How do we read this, by the way, out loud? How does one read this if you're going upwards? If you're moving upwards, how do we read this arrow if you're moving upwards? I say cheating on schoolwork is wrong, and then I will say what? If you're moving in the upward direction. I'll say why, because. Yeah. Javitesh, you got it, right? Ask why, because, right? So ask why, exactly. So you say cheating on schoolwork is wrong. Kyung, kyungki, because, right? Why? Because, and we're given here, not because 2, right? Because cheating is not wrong because 2. 2 is just a stupid number. Like, who cares? What does the number stand for? So you read it this way. You say cheating on schoolwork is wrong. Why? Because it means relying on someone else's knowledge, and the purpose of education is to rely on your own knowledge. And if we're working our way down, if we're going to work from this and this to this, we'd say, not 2, because 2 is just a number. We're not interested in that. We read out loud what it stands for. We say, it means relying on someone else's knowledge. What's the it mean? When we say it means relying on someone else's knowledge, given the context here, what should we replace this with? Cheating. It's often helpful, and the reason why I'm showing you these tricks is because I want you to do well, right? It's often helpful to replace these context-specific words with what they stand for. So that way, when you read out the proposition, you can know what it stands for. So you say, cheating means relying on someone else's knowledge. So notice, can everyone see my little red dot here? I'm going to read with the red dot. Cheating means relying on someone else's knowledge, and the purpose of education is to learn how to rely on your own knowledge. Therefore, cheating on schoolwork is wrong. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you got a question, ask your question. And how is this dependent? Well, look at the concepts that figure into this argument, right? You want to talk about a conclusion that has to do with being wrong. Okay, fair enough, man. And what does premise number 2 tell you? It means that cheating means relying on someone else's knowledge. What's wrong with relying on someone else's knowledge? So let's have fun with our airbrush for a second and answer, who was it that I was asking? Sharon Preet's question. Let's imagine, for instance, Sharon Preet, I want my airbrush. Let's change color. Sharon Preet, let's imagine a situation. Let's test this argument. Let's imagine that we're airbrushing this out of existence. We're going to airbrush this third claim out of existence to test whether or not this is in fact a relation of dependent support, right? Imagine that we have this, and I'm going to claim, let's say, that cheating is wrong because it means relying on someone else's knowledge. Let's say I'm going to say that. Right now, right, you're relying on my knowledge. When you go to the dentist and you get your teeth cleared, cleaned and analyzed and whatever, you're relying on someone else's knowledge. When you tell me there's 8 planets in the solar system, you're relying on someone else's knowledge. When, let's say you're asking someone for directions because you're trying to find your way to a certain SkyTrain station, you're relying on someone else's knowledge. Is there anything about relying on someone else's knowledge that makes it cheating or wrong? Yes or no? Just relying on someone else's knowledge, because that's what the premise 2 is about, right? Relying on someone else's knowledge. Is there anything inherently wrong about relying on someone else's knowledge? There's nothing wrong with relying on someone else's knowledge. Sometimes it's perfectly fine and it's not cheating, right? Like, for instance, if I say, look it up, and I told you it's okay to look it up, and by looking it up, you rely on someone else's knowledge. It's not cheating, right? Sharon Preet, do you see that? You can't move from 2 to 1 logically. You can't move from 2 to 1. you have to add something more. Do you see that, Charanpreet? If that's clear, type in clear. If you can't see it, let me know. We'll keep massaging this into place. Beautiful. And notice that what you need to do in addition, and now notice when I'm going to undo all my airbrushing here. Let's go back to the actual situation, right? The purpose of education is to learn how to rely on your own knowledge. Well, look, man, if now the purpose is for you to find your way around Vancouver without asking anyone else's for directions, then in that sense, relying on someone else's knowledge would be wrong because it's a different purpose. But just by itself, relying on someone else's knowledge, there's nothing wrong about that. To say that it's wrong would have to say that it violates the very purpose of education, and that's something that's said explicitly in 3. My friends, that was a great question. Did everyone benefit from that? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. Because notice how it's fun, right? Someone asks a question, makes a mistake or whatever, and we just kind of clarify it. And like, I want everyone to benefit. I want as much collateral damage as possible, right? Beautiful. Okay, cool. Let's do it. Let's do this one. Regular exercise strengthens muscles, strengthens the cardiovascular system, and lowers cholesterol. For all of those reasons, exercise regularly. Arnav, by the way, your hand is up, so let's not use the hand lower thing. If you want to ask me a question, just type in the chat bar because I can't track the hand lowering stuff. Lower your hand, and if you have a question, just ask me in the chat bar, the public chat bar, obviously, because I can't track it. Arnav, did you have a question? All right, cool. Accidentally. Okay, neat. Thank you. Because remember, I'm multitasking here. It's quite a bit. Lower your hand so that my pop-up can leave. And cool. All right. So what is the main conclusion of this argument? What should we put at the bottom over here? What is the main conclusion of this argument? Agreed. 4. Right? 4. And the reasons for that are that it strengthens the muscles, that it strengthens the cardiovascular system, and it lowers cholesterol. And notice these are independent reasons, by the way. Like if you go to the gym, you know, the young men, like 19-year-old men who go to work out, they're just concerned with their muscles. They couldn't care less about the lowering of cholesterol, right? And likewise, you could have a situation where an older person goes to lower their cholesterol and does their exercise, but they don't care about strengthening their muscle. It's not like they want that. These are independent reasons for doing it, right? Independent reasons. Good. Let's do some more practice together. Here's another page from our textbook. Since my car won't start, I'll have to take the bus, so I'll need to take exact change for the fare. What should I put here at the very bottom? Notice the structure here is a bit different than anything we've encountered so far. Since my car won't start, I'll have to take the bus, so I'll need to take exact change for the fare. What do I put at the very bottom? The bottom is the conclusion. Think about it. And again, try different possibilities. There's only so many possibilities, right? There's like 2, 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2. You can try all of them and see which one actually map on to what's above, right? What's at the bottom? 3. Okay, cool. Let's read out what 3 means. So 3 means I need to take exact change for the fare. Why? Someone give me a reason. Why do I need to take exact change for the fare? Because I'll have to take the bus. 2. Why do you have to take the bus? Because your car won't start. Why doesn't your car not start? I don't know. We're not told, right? But presumably there's a reason for that, right? And my car won't start because it's busted. Why is it busted? Because I didn't take it to the garage. Why didn't you take it to the garage, right? Because I don't have any money. Why didn't you have any money? Because I don't have a job, right? Like you can imagine, I'm going to have to keep twisting this totem pole here because I don't have enough space, right? But at each step would be therefore. So it's like I don't have a job, therefore I don't have any money, therefore I can't take my car to the garage, therefore my car is busted, therefore my car won't start, therefore I'll have to take the bus, therefore I need to take exact change for the fare. Can you see that, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. This is like a serial set of entailments, right? That's a logical structure right there. The arguments come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, right? And again, you're given the language argument, in English, and then you just have to find the structure. All right. In each of the following arguments, identify the conclusion, then determine whether the premises are dependent and independent. Let's have a look at this one first. Let's read the whole argument. To be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details, and Lenny is terrible at that, so he shouldn't go into law. What's the conclusion? 1, 2, or 3? And since that's the conclusion, in our diagram, do we put it at the top or the bottom? Where do we put conclusions, top or bottom, when we're drawing out our diagram with our pencil? At the bottom. All right, 3. Beautiful. Okay, cool. So we got 2 more reasons here, offered in support of 3. That to be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details, and Lenny is terrible at that. Are they offering dependent or independent support for the conclusion that he shouldn't go into law? To be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details, and Lenny is terrible at that. Dependent or independent support? You got it. Dependent support. Right? And one of the ways, again, a piece of advice, one of the ways in which you want to be even more explicit, Lenny is terrible at that. What does that stand for? Lenny is terrible at that. What the hell does that even mean? Like, what's that? Larry is terrible at? Not at law. Keeping track of details, that's right. Lenny is terrible at keeping track of details, right? That's what this means. And notice how that's helpful. It's going to help you clarify what this is saying, right? Number 2 means Lenny is terrible at keeping track of details. And notice how this is important. I haven't had a chance to mention this. There's no particular order here in which you present 1 and 2. A good argument diagram for this could also be this. There'd be no problem with it. You could read it in there's the order at the top there of those 2 premises is symmetrical. You could swap them and it wouldn't make a difference, right? So if I were to read it, let's say from left to right, 2 means Lenny is terrible at keeping track of details, and to be a lawyer, you need to be good at keeping track of details. Therefore, he shouldn't go into law. The fact that you put 1 plus 2 or 2 plus 1, right, is unimportant. Right? And also the conclusion could have been at the end. So it's not like 2 plus 1 equals 3. That's just luck. It doesn't track at all. Remember, it's not math. All right. So you can swap these 2 orders. Both of the diagrams in black that you see on the screen right now would get full marks. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you got a question, ask your question. Both are fine. Both are fine. However, if I were to do the following diagram, notice I'm going to do this. So it's going to be a diagram of dependent support, right? But I do this. The diagram in red would get what marks? How many marks would this get? Let's say it's out of 5. How many marks would this get? The one in red. Because what does that say? It said that Lenny is terrible at keeping track of details, right? This is not getting the argument structure correctly. We said that the main conclusion was that he shouldn't go into law. The main conclusion isn't 2. The main conclusion isn't, you can't just move this stuff around, right? This would get 0. That's a wrong answer. This is wrong. Correct and wrong. Okay, everyone? There's a correct diagram for this. The main conclusion is not that Lenny is terrible at keeping track of details. The main conclusion is that he shouldn't go into law. That's the conclusion of this argument. So the first thing you do is you plop that conclusion at the bottom. You read the whole argument, identify the main point, put that at the bottom, and then clarify the logical structure of the premises. Okay? There's a right or wrong answer to this stuff. You can't just keep moving them around. And it's not in virtue of math. It's like a 3 plus 1 doesn't make 2. That's not what we're talking about. Is that clear, everyone? The one in red would be getting 0. Can everyone see that? That's like a wrong answer. That's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. This is really important that you know that, because in 2 weeks, we're going to have a quiz, right? So you can't just go do like a salad of numbers, right? Just toss it up, make up whatever, right? It's like, no, that doesn't work that way. Okay, beautiful. Let's do this. Let's do another one. Molly is a very bright child. She began speaking on her first birthday, whereas most children do not begin to speak until later. What's the conclusion of this argument? What am I going to put at the very bottom? Okay, so Molly is a very bright child. That's one. Why, Arnav, do you say that Molly is a very bright child? Why? Pourquoi? Why do you say that? Because your mom could just say, she's a very bright child. It's like, who cares? Like, what are the reasons? Why are you saying that she's a very bright child? Because of 2 and 3. And now the question is, what's going to be the correct way of diagramming this? Dependent or independent support? So let's just look at this now, right? We have 2 argument diagrams here. Both are going to get the conclusion correctly. So one's going to be at the bottom, but one of these argument diagrams is correct, gets full marks, and the other gets 0. Which one is the correct one? The one on the left or the one on the right? You are correct. The one on the right is the correct one. You've got it, right? So this gets full marks, and this gets 0, right? It has to collaborate. Like if she began talking on her first birthday, let's say, right? That's claim number 2, proposition number 2. How does that tell you that's very bright? You have to compare that in order to say that she's very bright with some sort of background about when people start to speak. And 3 lets us know that most children do not begin to speak until later. And notice that if you had a situation, look, imagine, for instance, that this was, if you tried to do the following, if you tried to just do this, because this diagram here, right, tells you that you should be able to read what I've circled in red. You should be able to read that on its own. Well, let's read it out. Most children do not begin to speak until later. Therefore, Molly's a very bright child. That makes no sense. It doesn't tell us at all when she began to speak, nor does it talk about being bright at all, right? How are we moving from this? So this argument is incorrect. This one is correct. 5 marks versus 0. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. And again, practice is practice, right? That's what we want to do. Beautiful. Okay, cool. Let's do some more practice. So let's practice together, right? You're going to have a ton of homework for the next 2 weeks. And I want to send you, since we have some time left, we have roughly 20 minutes, a little under. Let's make sure that we make the most of our time. There are 2 reasons why Amrit should avoid going to med school. First, she has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. Second, she cannot afford the tuition cost. What's the point of this argument? What's the main conclusion? What point is it trying to make? Say it in English, like we can type it in because it's not been numbered, right? What's the conclusion of this argument? What's it trying to prove? Someone send you this as a text message. What's the point they're trying to make? What are they trying to prove? That Amrit should avoid going to med school. I agree. You got it. I'm going to write this out in English at the bottom here. Instead of doing numbers, just for the sake of practicing a little bit differently, I'm going to write it out here at the bottom. I'm going to use the same position. So I'm going to say Amrit should avoid going to med school. All right. That's my main conclusion. I'm putting it at the bottom, right? Now, of course, like anything else, we want to say why. And notice we have a beautiful locution here that tells us there are 2 reasons why. How gorgeous is that? It's kind of spoon feeding us the structure. Normally, when we say there are 2 reasons why, do we mean there are 2 same reasons or there are 2 different reasons? When we use that expression, there's 2 reasons, or there's 3 reasons why you should buy a Kia. There's, like different reasons or same reasons? Clearly different. Right? Different reasons. Okay, so we're told that there's going to be 2 different reasons why Amrit should avoid going to med school. So that tells us already a little bit, right, that we're going to have one set of reasons over here. That's going to be our first set of reasons. And we're going to be given a second set of reasons over here for why she should avoid going to med school. And notice this is going to speak in favor of what? A dependent or independent support. If you're going to have this kind of structure, what's that starting to look like? I'm going to give you one reason, and I'm going to give you another set of reasons, different reasons for why you should accept this conclusion. Is that looking like dependent or independent support? It's starting to look like independent support. Agreed. Right? Jai Vitesh, you got it. Notice here, first and second. All right, let's do second first of all. She cannot afford the tuition cost. All right, let's type that in. She cannot afford the tuition cost. So I said a moment ago that there'd be two reasons for it. I'm going to put it up here, right? And she is who? When we say she, let's replace that. Who we talk about? She cannot afford the tuition costs. Who are we talking about here? Yeah, Amrit. So we want to spell that out as clearly as possible. So Amrit can't afford the tuition, right? Notice that I'm going to circle this now, this whole thing in blue. If I were to just have this, right? Amrit can't afford the tuition costs. Therefore, Amrit should avoid going to med school. That kind of makes sense on its own, right? And that means that you don't really need another reason. That's a good enough reason. You could say this whole argument in blue, that's the argument from money, right? So she lacks money. Okay, but we said there are two reasons. And the first reason that was given, and it's first just because it was said first, is that she has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. My friends, I want you to just look at the portion I'm going to highlight. She has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. Just look at the portion in blue. Forget everything else. What are we looking at? Just the portion in blue. Forget everything else. She has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. What are we looking at? What's the technical term for what we're looking at right now? It's an argument, Arnav. You got it. It's an argument. Like, think about it. I'm going to really make it clear. Let's remove everything, right? Imagine I'm going to airbrush out of existence. All right, here we go. I'm going to airbrush out of existence everything else, right? She has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. If I airbrush everything out, let me have some fun here. Oopsie. Let me just be a little clearer. If I airbrush everything out, I'm going to use my airbrush as a kind of eraser. She has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. Can I replace the she with anything, suppose? Given that I airbrushed everything else. Who's she? We don't know, right? It's an argument. What's the conclusion of this argument? She has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. Let's ask, what's the conclusion of this argument? She won't get accepted. She won't get accepted. So we could write that as a conclusion that would be at the bottom. Why is it that she won't get accepted? Are we given a reason? Why won't she get accepted? You're being so pessimistic. Why won't she get accepted? Because she has a low GPA. Agreed. All right, so now let's undo, right? I'm using these tools in a way that's much more fancy, by the way, than what they can actually do. She has a low GPA, so she won't get accepted. Now I can have fun and put this over here, right? Amrit, now I know who it is again because I've reopened it, right? Won't get accepted. Won't get accepted. Notice that this is a result that we were able to obtain quite well because we knew when we looked at just the argument in blue what the structure was. It was a very straightforward structure. And what was the reason for why she won't get accepted? It was that Amrit has what? A low GPA. You got it, my friends. Amrit has a low GPA. She has a low GPA. I'm going to finish this out here. PA. All right, there you go. She has a low GPA. Now notice we've got relations of entailment over here. I'm just going to put them, let's write them out because I forgot to put my arrows, right? Here we are. Let's put those arrows. Amrit won't get accepted. Amrit can't avoid the tuition costs. Now let's look at this whole thing together. Let's clear this up. Let's test whether we got this argument structure correctly. Follow my red ball and stop me if I make sense. If I make sense, write yes. If I don't make sense, write no when I ask you. Amrit can't afford the tuition cost. Therefore, Amrit should avoid going to med school. Does that make sense? Yes or no? We're testing. We're going to test everything in both directions. Beautiful. All right. Now we're going to go the other way around. We're going to do the bottom up. Amrit should avoid going to med school. Why? Because Amrit can't afford the tuition. Does that make sense? Yes or no? You have to test it both ways to verify. Beautiful. All right, now we're going to do this one. Amrit has a low GPA. Therefore, Amrit won't get accepted. Therefore, Amrit should avoid going to med school. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Again, you're all logical reasoners, right? Well, we're going to fine tune those skills. Beautiful. And again, we're going to work the other way up now. Amrit should avoid going to med school. Why? Because Amrit won't get accepted. Why do you say that Amrit won't get accepted? Well, because Amrit has a low GPA. Did that make sense? Yes or no? There you have it. We did it correctly. And notice here, there was a lot of indicator words, right? So there are two reasons why. That kind of already told us there's going to be two families of reasons. Now, why do we do all of this work? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we do all of this work. One of them, when we have a relation of independent support, we know that one of the reasons can survive without the existence of the other. This is why we do all of this. Here's the cash value, if you will, right? Let's imagine, for instance, right, that this argument here doesn't exist. If this argument doesn't exist, this other argument on the other side still exists. Conversely, if this argument doesn't exist, this argument still holds. Okay, so let's have some fun. Amrit wins $1 billion. Should Amrit go to med school, yes or no? Amrit wins $1 billion. Should she go to med school, yes or no? I've got some yeses and I've got some nos, and Charanpreet told no and gave me a good reason. She'd still have a low GPA, right? So, okay, so let's go here and let's have a look at our propositions. We have a proposition here to the effect that she cannot afford the tuition costs. Now, it's a grammatically complete sentence that could be true or could be false. Earlier, we took it to be true, but when she wins $1 million, is this claim here, this proposition, does it become true or false? That she can't afford the tuition costs, she wins $1 million. What's the status of this proposition? Is it true or is it false? It becomes false. The moment she wins $1 billion, this proposition becomes false. Okay, that means that we're going to airbrush that now. We're going to remove it, right? Actually, I'm going to crosshatch it in red, right? Because we're going to say, okay, it's no longer a good reason for accepting the conclusion. But what the heck does your bank account have to do with your transcript, right? What about her GPA? She wins $1 million. How's her GPA? Is it still high or is it low? You win $1 billion. It's transferred into your bank account. What happens to your KPU transcript? It's still low, right? It's still low. There are two reasons why. There's one set of reasons that hinged on her GPA and the other that hinged on monetary considerations. Even if suddenly she's lucky, she wins $1 billion and the monetary considerations are no longer a problem, guess what? Try to go to UBC and bribe them. See how that works out for you, right? Or a KPU for that matter. It's like, hey, get me into med school. What's your GPA? 1. But I'm a billionaire. What's going to happen? Will they admit you or not admit you? You want to go to med school? You're a billionaire, but your GPA is like 1. You're totally not going to get admitted. So don't even bother, right? You should avoid going to med school. This is why we do this logical structure stuff, right? Because if you go over here and all you have is a piece of text, you haven't done any of the work to make visible the logical relations. You just read this with your ordinary common sense intuitions, and they're not crisp, they're not tight. Whereas if you take the time to do an argument diagram, then what we can do is we can turn around and you and I and the whole class, we can analyze the argument diagram. So if you have a sophisticated, in this case, we're trying really silly issues, right? Because I want to keep it simple. I don't want your mind to be cluttered. But we can then analyze and pinpoint which propositions are true, which is false, and which truth or falsehood is actually going to be decisive for accepting or rejecting the conclusion. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. And what do you think? You find this helpful? Did you like this? Because we're wrapping up. That's the skill that I want you to practice over the next 2 weeks. Do you like this? Is this concrete? Is this like... I think it's really vital skill, man. I think like everyone should learn this stuff. Like, because you can think it ranges over everything, man. It's like, it's just learning to think well, right? And we've got tools to think well. So that's what I want you to practice. There's way more practice that you can do. There's different structures that you're going to encounter. Let's look at some different structures. As these arguments get larger and larger, you're going to encounter bigger structures. Here's your argument diagramming handout. That's your homework for this week. It's several pages long. It's got 25 arguments. I'm getting tired. 25 arguments. And notice I'm going to start really small and some are going to be familiar. So the instructions here are print this file and diagram the following arguments. Now, it's really important that you print it out on paper. I know it's much easier to think you want to do it on screen. If you do it on screen, make sure that you're nice and flexible, like kind of like my tools right now, right? That if I screw up, I can change my mind and whatever, that you got something to change your mind with, because it's not always going to be obvious by looking harder or on a first attempt. And for questions that are partially pre-answered, enter the numbers corresponding to the numbered claims in the text. So for instance, I believe that the earth is round because it casts a round shadow on the moon. You plot the correct numbers here. I've already given you the skeletal structure, but for some other cases, they're not given to you and you have to do it yourself. And these arguments are going to get trickier and trickier, and they're not always going to have 3 propositions in all. Sometimes they're going to be more complicated. And as the arguments become bigger, this logical structure is going to become a little trickier, and you need to practice to figure out what those are. You've got 25 arguments to work on, and you're going to have 20 solutions. They're also going to be available on Moodle once we say goodbye. And you look at the solutions, and if you don't get it right the first time around, find out why you got it wrong. Remember, ask yourself out loud. Why? Because when you move on the way up, and therefore on you move your way down, and test whether or not it can survive the supposition of absence of one of the premises and not the other, and so on.